At 5:42 a.m., the silence over the Pacific was broken. A single radar ping echoed inside a U.S. command center. Moments later, a warning flashed across every screen. Missile lock detected, B-2 Spirit. Thousands of miles away, a stealth bomber flying routine patrol had just been targeted by China's coastal defense system. Within seconds, one of the world's most advanced warplanes was in danger. But what happened next stunned every analyst watching that feed. Before we begin, like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell icon, because in the next few minutes, you'll learn how that missile never reached its target, and why China's base didn't survive the morning. For months, tensions across the Pacific had been building quietly, almost invisibly. China had expanded its military presence across the South China Sea, building radar outposts, anti-air batteries, and missile silos on artificial islands. The United States responded with increased aerial patrols and naval movements, aiming to remind Beijing that the Pacific was still an open domain. But beneath the political statements, both sides were watching each other in silence, studying movements, frequencies, and responses. The morning of the incident began like many before it. A U.S. B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, part of the 509th Bomb Wing, was flying a routine high-altitude patrol roughly 600 miles from the Chinese coastline. The B-2, often called the Invisible Giant, carries radar-absorbing material that makes it nearly impossible to detect on most systems. It can fly 6,000 nautical miles without refueling and deliver 20 tons of precision weapons anywhere on Earth. The flight plan was standard, a presence mission meant to collect data, demonstrate reach, and reassure allies near Guam and Japan. But that day, something was different. The Chinese People's Liberation Army Rocket Force had placed several of its coastal missile brigades on heightened readiness. Satellite photos taken days earlier showed new fuel trucks and mobile launcher units moving into the Fujian province region. Intelligence analysts believed it was a response to a recent U.S. Navy carrier strike group drill near the Philippine Sea, where American ships simulated long-range missile interception. At 4:50 a.m., U.S. Pacific Command began tracking irregular radar sweeps coming from the Chinese coast. Analysts marked them as search patterns. The B-2's onboard sensors picked up faint electromagnetic signals, but no direct threat. At this stage, it was just another day in the long chess game of electronic warfare. The aircraft's call sign that morning was Reaper 09. The two-man crew had flown dozens of similar missions before. Inside the jet's pressurized cabin, the pilots followed protocol, maintaining radio silence, scanning displays, and logging every anomaly. Then, just before dawn, their onboard threat warning receiver lit up. A high-power radar system had locked onto their aircraft for the first time. That radar belonged to a Chinese HQ-19 missile battery positioned roughly 250 kilometers inland. Designed to hit targets above 100 kilometers in altitude, the HQ-19 can reach speeds of over Mach 14, nearly 10,000 miles per hour. Normally, this system would never be used without higher authorization. But according to intelligence gathered later, local commanders believed they were tracking a U.S. reconnaissance drone, not a manned stealth bomber. Back at the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command headquarters in Hawaii, communication links activated instantly. Satellite feeds began recording radar spikes, and electronic surveillance aircraft in the area moved closer. American officials realized that if China fired, it would mark the first direct hostile action against a U.S. stealth platform in decades. The rules of engagement were clear. U.S. aircraft could defend themselves only if attacked. Commanders in Hawaii relayed a coded message to Reaper 09. Maintain heading. No counteraction. The B-2 pilots knew what that meant. Stay invisible, trust the technology, and don't panic. By 5:35 a.m., radar activity intensified. Then, the unmistakable signal came through. Missile launch detected. At that moment, a DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile, modified for air interception, was fired from coastal China. The projectile climbed fast, guided by over-the-horizon radar and infrared tracking. It was designed to hunt stealth targets by sensing their heat trail instead of radar reflection. Inside the B-2, the crew stayed calm. They deployed countermeasures, switched to low thermal mode, and changed altitude by 4,000 feet in under 20 seconds. The onboard defensive system, called ZSR-63, began jamming radar frequencies across multiple bands. It was a modern ballet of precision, silence, speed, and focus. Meanwhile, U.S. satellites in geostationary orbit tracked everything. Within 15 seconds, the missile trajectory showed it would not reach the aircraft. It was off by more than 20 kilometers. But that didn't end the danger, because for the U.S. military, the act of firing was enough to trigger an automated response chain. At 5:41 a.m., the B-2's crew sent an encrypted attack report to Pacific Command. Within seconds, Task Force Delta, operating hundreds of miles away aboard U.S. Navy destroyers, received the signal. The retaliation sequence was already in motion. The United States had long prepared for such a scenario. Every missile launch in the region was monitored by SBIRs, space-based infrared system satellites capable of pinpointing the exact origin of heat signatures. The coordinates of the Chinese launcher were identified in less than 12 seconds. What followed next was not an argument, not a warning, but an order. The first retaliatory strike of the morning had just been approved. The U.S. Navy was about to send a message that would echo across the Pacific. And at that moment, the world shifted from tension to action. At 5:43 a.m., the order was confirmed. The retaliation was to be swift, limited, and unmistakable. The message from the U.S. Pacific Command was short and clear. Neutralize the source. Avoid escalation beyond the launch zone. Within seconds, the USS John Finn, DDG-113, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer positioned 320 nautical miles east of Taiwan, adjusted its targeting systems. Its Aegis combat system locked onto the coordinates transmitted by the B-2AS encrypted signal, the same grid square where the Chinese DF-21D launcher had just fired. On board, sailors moved fast but silent. The crew had trained for years for this exact moment, a retaliatory precision strike, or RPS. It was designed to disable enemy launch capability without widening the war. At 5:46 a.m., the destroyer's vertical launch system, VLS, opened, and two Tomahawk Block V missiles roared into the air. Each carried a 1,000-pound conventional warhead and could hit a target with less than 2 meters of error, even from hundreds of miles away. As the Tomahawks climbed through the thin layer of morning fog, their guidance systems synced with GPS and satellite data relayed from SBIRs. The missiles dropped to sea-skimming altitude, invisible to radar, racing west toward the Chinese coastline at nearly 550 miles per hour. Meanwhile, the B-2 crew, Reaper 09, maintained silence. They had narrowly escaped a direct hit. Their instruments showed the missile's detonation hundreds of meters below their flight path. Even though they were safe, they knew something irreversible had just begun. The U.S. had entered active combat engagement in the Pacific theater for the first time in decades. On the Chinese side, the scene was chaos. The PLA rocket force base near Fuzhou, which had fired the missile, was still tracking radar signatures when their systems detected multiple incoming threats. The Tomahawks appeared on radar only 70 seconds before impact, too late for an organized defense. Alarms blared across the compound. Personnel rushed to shelters. But precision-guided missiles do not wait for orders. At 5:49 a.m., the first Tomahawk struck the base's radar array, a massive rotating dish responsible for mid-course guidance. The explosion was direct. The structure collapsed instantly. The second missile hit seconds later, striking the launcher vehicle that had fired the DF-21D. The result was catastrophic. The stored propellant ignited, creating a chain reaction that consumed the nearby missile transporters. Within a minute, the site was burning. Satellite feeds from U.S. reconnaissance platforms showed multiple secondary explosions. Fuel trucks, communication towers, and electrical lines went up in flames. The strike had not only eliminated the launcher, but crippled the entire command node of the regional battery. At the same time, emergency channels across the Pacific lit up. The Chinese defense network scrambled to determine if this was a localized strike or the start of a larger U.S. offensive. Fighter squadrons from nearby air bases were ordered to scramble, but the confusion was total. Many radar operators were offline, and communication lines were destroyed in the blast. In Washington, the National Security Council convened an emergency meeting. The president was briefed that a Chinese missile had been launched at a U.S. aircraft, and the U.S. Navy had executed a controlled response under standing defense protocols. Intelligence reports confirmed that no civilian casualties were detected, and the damage was restricted to the military installation responsible for the launch. By 6:05 a.m., the fire at the Chinese missile base had reached its ammunition depot. A thunderous explosion sent debris thousands of feet into the air. The base's radar coverage over the South China Sea went dark. U.S. satellites recorded a heat signature nearly 3 miles wide. The site was effectively erased. For American forces, the response was complete. The B-2 bomber turned north, returning to safe airspace near Guam. The destroyer resumed its defensive patrol route. In less than 30 minutes, the engagement was over. But for both nations, the silence that followed was louder than the explosion itself. Across the Pacific, the U.S. military entered DEFCON 3, a heightened readiness level not seen since the early 2000s. Carrier strike groups repositioned near the Philippine Sea. Submarines in the region received encrypted orders to maintain stealth patrols. Every command knew what this meant. The next move had to be political, not military. But as dawn broke across Asia, social media and independent trackers began reporting satellite images showing a massive crater where the Chinese missile base once stood. The footage spread fast. News outlets in Tokyo, Sydney, and Washington picked up the story within hours. By 7:00 a.m., the world had learned that China had fired on an American stealth bomber, and that the U.S. had responded with precision fire that erased an entire missile site in under 20 minutes. What had started as a radar lock turned into the most dangerous military exchange between two superpowers in decades. And while the world held its breath, military analysts everywhere began to ask the same question. Was this a warning or the beginning of something much bigger? The entire event, from missile launch to base destruction, was over in less than 25 minutes, but every second was driven by advanced systems, protocols, and precision engineering. Understanding how it unfolded requires a closer look at the technology and tactics behind both sides' moves. Let's start with the Chinese weapon, the DF-21D, often called the carrier killer. It's a medium-range ballistic missile designed to target large naval vessels like aircraft carriers. With a range of nearly 1,500 kilometers, 930 miles, and a speed exceeding Mach 10, it can hit a moving ship with a guided warhead. But on this morning, it wasn't used against a carrier. It was fired at a B-2 Spirit bomber, one of the rarest and most secretive aircraft in the U.S. arsenal. That choice was significant. The B-2 Spirit is a stealth strategic bomber built by Northrop Grumman. Only 21 were ever made, and each costs over $2 billion. Its surface absorbs radar waves, making it nearly invisible to traditional detection systems. The only way to target it is to use high-frequency tracking radars and hope for a brief moment of signal reflection, exactly what China AS Coastal Radar Network near Fuzhou attempted that morning. Once the B-2's presence was detected, the launch was authorized using China's Integrated Rocket Force Protocol, which connects radar sites directly to mobile launcher crews. But that speed became their downfall. The base failed to apply its multi-source confirmation system, a safeguard meant to prevent false locks. Instead, they fired immediately. Now, the U.S. response. The USS John Finn, DDG-113, belongs to the Arleigh Burke-class Flight II-IA destroyers, among the most advanced surface combatants in the world. Its Aegis combat system can track and engage over 100 targets simultaneously, linking sensors from satellites, aircraft, and other ships. When the B-2 transmitted its encrypted emergency ping, known as a Raven distress signal, the destroyer automatically synced that data with satellite coordinates. The target zone was identified within 40 seconds. The ship's Tomahawk Block V missiles were the weapon of choice for retaliation. Unlike earlier versions, the Block V is built for high-precision, low-collateral damage strikes. Each missile uses terrain contour mapping and digital scene matching, comparing real-time images of the ground with stored satellite photos, to ensure it hits exactly where it is aimed. Its speed is roughly 550 mph, flying just 100 feet above sea level to stay invisible to radar. From launch to impact, the Tomahawks took less than 6 minutes to reach the Chinese coastline. Their low trajectory, combined with the chaos caused by the DF-21D launch, made early detection nearly impossible. Chinese air defense systems, including the HQ-9 interceptors, were still recalibrating after the missile launch and failed to lock onto the incoming Tomahawks in time. When the first Tomahawk hit the radar array, it destroyed the base's primary phased array radar, effectively blinding the site. The second missile's impact was even more devastating. It hit the launcher zone directly, igniting stored rocket fuel and conventional warheads. The resulting explosion measured the equivalent of 5 tons of TNT. U.S. satellites used infrared and electro-optical sensors to confirm destruction. Analysts in the Pacific Command Center identified over 18 secondary explosions, which indicated total ammunition loss. The strike AS precision was so exact that it destroyed the missile base without damaging nearby civilian areas, located just 3 kilometers away. One key element that made the U.S. response so efficient was its network-centric warfare capability. Every American unit, from the B-2 bomber to the destroyer to the satellites overhead, operated as part of one digital ecosystem called Link 16. This system allows real-time communication between air, land, sea, and space assets. It's what enabled the destroyer to launch retaliatory missiles almost instantly after receiving the coordinates. In contrast, China's C4ISR network, command control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, relies heavily on ground-based infrastructure. Once the Fuzhou site was hit, regional command centers lost communication. The radar blackout extended across a 120-mile radius, leaving several missile batteries unable to receive new orders. The B-2 Spirit's stealth played another vital role in the success of this operation. Even though it was the initial target, its onboard defensive management system, DMS, immediately detected radar emissions from the Chinese site. This early warning allowed the aircraft to transmit coordinates before the missile was even launched. The bomber's crew then executed a low-altitude evasion maneuver, flying just 1,000 feet above the ocean to break radar lock, a move that saved their aircraft and gave the U.S. Navy a precise target for retaliation. By the time Chinese military satellites detected the Tomahawk launches, it was too late. Their infrared sensors picked up missile exhaust plumes only moments before the impacts. Internal reports later showed that the site's interception systems were overwhelmed by false signals, likely caused by electronic interference from the U.S. Navy's EA-18G Growler aircraft stationed over the Philippine Sea. In military terms, this was a perfect example of a measured escalation. The U.S. didn't respond with overwhelming force or a wider attack. Instead, it executed a surgical precision strike, a demonstration of capability and control. Technically, the U.S. didn't start a war that morning, but through the combination of stealth, speed, and real-time coordination, it proved that even the most advanced missile defense networks could be blinded and destroyed in minutes. By the end of the day, analysts agreed. The exchange was short, but strategically it changed everything. It redefined deterrence in the Pacific. It showed that even one mistake, one radar lock, could trigger a cascade of consequences too fast to stop. By 6:30 a.m., the smoke had cleared over the Chinese coastline. Satellite imagery confirmed what the U.S. command already knew. The missile base was gone. The radar towers were flattened, launch vehicles destroyed, and communications completely severed. The once busy facility had turned into a blackened crater stretching hundreds of meters wide. In the U.S. Pacific Command's operations room, the atmosphere was calm but heavy. Every officer understood the weight of what had just occurred. A U.S. stealth bomber had been targeted. And for the first time in over 2 decades, the United States had directly struck back at a Chinese military position. The message was unmistakable. The U.S. would not hesitate to defend its assets, even deep in contested territory. Within hours, the Pentagon released a carefully worded statement. It confirmed that a U.S. aircraft operating in international airspace was targeted by a hostile missile system, and that a proportional defensive response was executed against the source of that launch. No names, no locations, but everyone in the defense world knew what it meant. In Beijing, the official response was one of denial and caution. Chinese state media claimed that a training accident had caused explosions at a coastal site and dismissed reports of U.S. involvement as Western propaganda. But inside military circles, alarm bells were ringing. The strike had exposed vulnerabilities in their early warning systems. The same networks designed to protect China's eastern coast from potential naval incursions. Across the Pacific, reaction was swift. In Tokyo, Japanese defense officials raised the national alert level and began emergency consultations with U.S. counterparts. Australia expressed support for freedom of navigation and aerial operations in international airspace. The United Kingdom, though distant from the region, released a statement emphasizing the need for stability and restraint in the Indo-Pacific. The markets reacted too. Within hours, oil prices rose by 7%. Defense stocks in the U.S. surged. News anchors across America broke into live coverage with one line repeated everywhere. China fired on a U.S. aircraft and paid the price. Behind the scenes, both militaries quietly shifted posture. The U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet repositioned carrier groups farther east, away from immediate engagement zones. The Chinese Navy, or plan, increased patrols near the Taiwan Strait and moved anti-ship assets closer to the coastline. Satellite tracking showed dozens of ships subtly adjusting formation, a silent chess match at sea. But the most important outcome wasn't visible on radar. It was psychological. The U.S. had demonstrated rapid response capability, the ability to identify, locate, and neutralize a threat in under half an hour. That speed stunned even experienced strategists. For Washington, the operation was proof of deterrence, a controlled act of power that reinforced U.S. dominance without sparking full-scale war. For Beijing, it was a warning shot, a clear reminder that even advanced radar and missile systems weren't untouchable. By nightfall, the world had changed. The Pacific was quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that carried tension, a silence that comes before something bigger. Both sides had drawn new lines in the ocean, and every commander, every analyst, and every nation watching knew that the next move, or the next mistake, could decide the balance of power for decades to come. The Pacific dawn that began with a single missile lock ended as a defining moment in modern warfare. It showed how fragile peace has become, how one radar ping, one decision made in seconds, can bring 2 nuclear powers within inches of direct war. For the United States, this was not just a military victory. It was a message that technology, coordination, and resolve still define the balance of power. A B-2 spirit, nearly invisible to radar, represented decades of innovation. A Tomahawk missile, launched from miles away, showed that precision can achieve what massive force cannot. Together they formed a quiet statement. America still controls the skies. For China, the loss was more than material. It was strategic. The strike exposed weaknesses in its command and control network and raised questions inside the PLA about readiness and overconfidence. It also reminded global powers that advanced weapons mean little without the discipline to use them wisely. Internationally, this event will be remembered as the Fuzhou Flashpoint. It wasn't a war, but it carried the weight of one. In a matter of minutes, both nations tested not only their technology but also their restraint. The world saw how close we stand to a conflict that no one truly wants, but one that could ignite faster than anyone can control. Military analysts later said the engagement redefined deterrence in the 21st century. Wars are no longer fought over years. They are fought in minutes, decided by algorithms and watched by satellites. The next confrontation may not even involve soldiers, only data, drones, and decisions made by machines faster than human thought. And yet, amid all that speed and precision, this story remains deeply human. A bomber crew holding their breath, a destroyer captain giving a single command, leaders on both sides staring at glowing screens, knowing that every choice could change the world. At dawn, one side fired. By sunrise, the other responded. In that short span of time, history took a turn, quiet, exact, and unforgettable. Because in modern warfare, the battle is not just about who fires first, it's about who controls the moment after, and on that morning, the United States did exactly that.